How my family abandoned me over my sister's lies and what happened next. It's strange to think how much a single email changed the course of my life. One message, a few paragraphs, and suddenly, a decade of silence had collapsed into a few lines of text. I hadn't expected it to come to this, my final act. A digital message composed in the middle of the night, in a haze of old memories, fractured loyalties, and a resolve I never thought I had. But before I explain what happened that night, I should take you back. Because if I'm honest, the beginning of this story isn't in that email, it's in the day my family abandoned me. I grew up in a typical suburban town in America. A place where lawns were well manicured. Mailboxes lined the street in tidy rows. And neighbors would wave at each other out of habit rather than friendliness. My family was no different from any of the others around us. Or so I thought. We weren't particularly close, but I suppose we had our moments. My father, a quiet man who often seemed lost in thought, worked long hours at a local accounting firm. My mother was always bustling around the house, fussing over minor things that somehow seemed important to her. And then there was my sister, Jenna. Jenna was 2 years older than me. And, to be honest, she was the golden child. While I had always struggled to find my footing, Jenna excelled effortlessly. She was brilliant in academics, graceful in everything she did, and stunningly beautiful. If you were to ask anyone in our town, they would remember Jenna as the perfect one. I was just her little brother, shadowed by her light. Growing up, I spent a lot of time alone, often lost in books or spending hours on random hobbies that never seemed to stick. My parents would glance at me occasionally, a mix of confusion and concern in their eyes. I wasn't troubled, I was just quiet. Maybe too quiet, but the truth is, I always knew my place. I was the background character in Jenna's world. Jenna went on to marry a man named Mark. They seemed happy, with their wide smiles and endless photos from exotic vacations. She had it all: a loving husband, a promising career, and the adoration of everyone around her. Meanwhile, I was just struggling through community college, trying to figure out who I was supposed to be. I envied her, of course, but I never resented her. At least, not at first. It was 2 years into Jenna's marriage when things started to go wrong. At first, it was subtle: the way Mark's smile would falter at family gatherings, the way Jenna's laugh seemed forced. But soon, the cracks became impossible to ignore. Mark started spending more time working late, and Jenna grew distant, distracted by something she wouldn't talk about. Eventually, rumors started to swirl, whispers that Mark was seeing someone else. I remember the night Jenna finally told us they were getting divorced. Our family was devastated. My parents were furious with Mark, but even more so with Jenna. In their eyes, a marriage was sacred, and failure wasn't an option. I could see the shame in their eyes, the bitterness they tried to hide. But Jenna was their golden child, and they couldn't entirely abandon her. That's when she turned to me. She asked me to help her, to be there for her in a way no one else could. I tried to support her, listening as she vented about Mark's betrayals, about the life she thought she'd have and the one she was left with instead. I became her confidant, her shoulder to cry on, the one person she could rely on in a world that felt like it was collapsing around her. But then, one night, everything changed. I was at Jenna's house, helping her sort through some old papers, when she suddenly turned to me, her eyes dark with an intensity I hadn't seen before. She told me she needed to confess something, that she'd been carrying a secret that she couldn't hold on to any longer. And then, with a trembling voice, she told me that I was the reason her marriage had fallen apart. She claimed that Mark had always felt overshadowed by my presence, that he'd seen me as a threat, as someone who was always there in the background, silently judging him. She told me that Mark had felt pressured to be perfect because of me, that he'd felt I was everything he wasn't, and in the end, that pressure had driven him to seek comfort elsewhere. I was stunned. I'd barely interacted with Mark, let alone had any influence over his decisions. But Jenna's words cut deep. She was adamant, unyielding, convinced that I had somehow, unwittingly, ruined her life. And the worst part? My parents believed her. From that moment on, I was cast out. They didn't say it outright, but the change was palpable. Phone calls went unanswered. Family gatherings happened without me. I'd become the black sheep, the outsider. I tried to defend myself, to explain that I hadn't done anything wrong, but it was no use. Jenna had planted the seed of doubt, and it had taken root in the hearts of the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Years passed. I moved to a new city, found a job, and tried to build a life for myself. I pushed thoughts of my family to the back of my mind, burying them beneath layers of routine and distractions. I told myself that I didn't need them, that I was better off alone. But the truth was, the pain never really went away. It lingered, a dull ache that reminded me of everything I'd lost. Then, one night, everything changed. I received an email from Jenna. It was short, almost dismissive, but it reopened wounds I thought had healed. She wrote to tell me that she was getting remarried, that she'd found happiness again, and that she hoped I could find it in myself to forgive her for the past. No apologies, no acknowledgement of the damage she'd done, just a simple statement, as if she were tying up loose ends before moving on with her life. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every memory, every hurt, every betrayal, and then, almost without thinking, I found myself at my computer, typing out a reply. It wasn't a message of forgiveness, it was a message of truth. I told Jenna everything I'd kept bottled up for years. I reminded her of how she'd turned my family against me, of the pain she'd caused, of the years I'd spent alone because of her lies. And then I told her something I knew would shatter the perfect image she'd built for herself. Because the truth was, I knew something she didn't. I knew that Mark hadn't left her because of me. He'd left her because of her own mistakes, her own betrayals. She'd been the one to stray first, the one who had opened the door to doubt. And now, years later, I had the proof. I attached a series of old emails I'd found, messages between Jenna and an old flame she'd rekindled during her marriage to Mark. They were incriminating, undeniable. She had been the one to betray him, not the other way around. And yet, she blamed me for everything, casting me out to save herself. I sent the email without a second thought, watching as it vanished into the void. In that moment, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if I'd finally taken back control of my own story. The fallout was swift. Within days, my family reached out to me, their messages filled with shock, confusion, and apologies. Jenna tried to contact me too, but I ignored her. I didn't need her explanations or her excuses. For the first time in years, I felt free. Looking back, I don't regret what I did. My actions may have been harsh, but they were a necessary truth. Sometimes, the only way to heal is to confront the shadows that others have cast over your life. And for me, that meant revealing the secrets that had kept me chained to a past I didn't deserve. Now, I live a life free from the weight of my family's judgment. I built a future on my own terms, unburdened by the lies that once defined me. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how deep it's buried. In the end, I wasn't the villain in Jenna's story. I was just the truth she didn't want to face.